Welcome. The following short presentation reviews the history and current status of Connecticut's progressive climate change and greenhouse gas emission reduction goals and their relationship to affordable housing development within the state. The presentation was developed by Kathy Dorgan for the Connecticut Multifamily Housing Peer-to-Peer Network, a group of affordable housing stakeholders focused on improving the sustainability and performance of multifamily housing across the state. The presentation also includes special remarks from Bryan, Garcia, President and CEO of the Connecticut Green Bank. Key takeaways from the presentation are: 1. Buildings account for the second highest amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the state, right behind transportation, and housing accounts for more than half of building sector emissions, primarily through energy use. Housing, as currently designed, built, and operated, not only contributes to climate change in the state, but is also negatively affected by climate change, including cost, health, and environmental degradation impacts. 3, it doesn't have to be this way. We have the design, construction, and operations knowledge now to substantially improve the performance of housing in the state. In the process, we can contribute to meeting Connecticut's impressive climate goals and targets, improve affordability, comfort, and health of our residents, and at the same time, provide skilled jobs and help create a 21st century workforce across the state.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you to Maureen Malla, the Boston Society of Architects, and the Carbon Leadership that provided some of the slides that are in this presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about the reason that climate change is important to housing in Connecticut and the reason that housing is important as we think about climate change. In a single year, more than 16 million people in the world lost their housing as a result of climate change-induced events, and that included more than 1 million people in the US. Looking forward, for every 2 degrees Fahrenheit of average change in temperature, we expect to see 1 billion people losing a safe and habitable place to live. So we really care a lot about addressing climate change in order to be able to provide housing. This is an important worldwide, but it's also important in Connecticut. We saw at Marina Village, some of the units of which had been very recently rehabilitated, that we lost hundreds of units of housing, and that rebuilding those units will not only require replacement, but tens of millions of dollars in infrastructure to make the area habitable. We've also seen this in the impacts of climate disasters outside of Connecticut impacting Connecticut housing. Recent events in Puerto Rico and Houston and other places have brought friends and family to Connecticut, which we welcome, but of course have to figure out how to house, and that's one of our many issues to face. By 2060, the world is projected to add as much building space as there is currently in the world. And so the quality and the energy use of that space is very, very important. And to try to picture that, that means that we're adding the building space that exists in New York City to the planet every 34 days. So in a little over a month, we build all of the buildings in New York again, and we'll do that for 40 years. And this is important because building operations and construction contribute a lot of CO2. Almost 40% of the CO2 added to the atmosphere every year as a result of either building operations or construction. And in addition to CO2 contributions, the various pollution impacts of all of that carbon being burned are very important. About 1/3 of deaths are a direct result, and that includes problems with respiration, as you would expect, but also circulatory effects that contribute to heart disease, and increasingly we're learning about nervous system impacts that lead to strokes and lack of intellectual capacity. In California, there's been some recent good news, though, as they've taken their coal and their oil burning power plants off of their grid. They're already seeing in 12 months almost 2% reduction in premature births as a result of the higher air quality there. This is really important because 95% of people on the planet have air quality that's not acceptable. And in intellectual learning alone, we lose the equivalent of 1 year of education because of the diminishment of our brain capacity because of air quality. And we're not doing well in so many health indicators, and we have good reason to believe that one of the reasons for this is air quality. Asthma alone is a big part of the contribution to these issues. If we were able to take asthma related costs out in a single year, we could build 27,000 units of housing. In Mount Sinai, studied green building and preliminarily found that the number of asthma related days that were impacted was about a third of what it was prior, so that by moving into a high performance green building, children and adults missed many, many fewer days of work and school. Likewise, there's been a lot of study of air quality in office buildings and simulations of that. And by doubling clean air, there's almost 60% increase in cognitive function, and even going higher has additional benefits. So when we think about carbon reduction, we're thinking about protecting the public, both in terms of human health, injury, mental health, food supply, and infectious disease. And I used this slide in a presentation a year ago, and one of the questions I got was, aren't you being alarmist about the opportunity for infectious disease or a global pandemic being something we'd really experience? And I think we've learned that indeed, it is more than a possibility. And what I don't think we completely understand is how climate events contribute to disease. And the disruption of wild animal populations is most certainly part of what caused COVID, but has already caused other diseases that haven't been as widespread, but probably others going forward. Obviously, we also have loss of property from storm and flooding and fire that we're seeing currently and we'll expect to see more. There's also important resource implications of climate change. Habitat loss is one. We know a lot about that on the land, but ocean acidification is an important thing, and that impacts a lot of the protein that we eat in the planet through supplies of fish and other seaweed, etc. Salinization is affecting both the water supply and, of course, the loss of agricultural land. One of the reasons in Connecticut we have the governor's goals is that study has shown that it is cheaper to mitigate climate change than to try to adapt to it. And so one of the reasons that we don't have all of the money we should have for housing is because of increasing costs in healthcare and loss of infrastructure that we could avoid with avoiding more climate change. In Connecticut and other places, we see rising healthcare costs, lost business and personal income, and resulting loss of tax revenue, and both on the income side, but also real estate, loss of course, people's personal property, and increasing insurance rates tied to that. And many of our water, sewer, and utility plants are located in areas prone to flooding that has other cost implications for government. Also, as weather changes, there's requirements for changes to buildings that has cost implications. Bryan's going to talk a little bit more about the governor's goals and how those relate to the work we're doing. Bryan Garcia is the president and CEO of the Green Bank. Bryan.
Thank you, Kathy. Hello, everyone. So I wanted to provide everyone with some context on Connecticut's bipartisan support and leadership on climate change historically. So let me take you a little bit through that, and then I'm going to bring us up to where we are currently in the state of Connecticut. The history of climate change leadership in Connecticut actually goes back to Governor Rowland. when in August of 2001, in Westbrook, Connecticut, there was a conference of New England governors and Eastern Canadian premiers that led to Resolution 26-4 concerning energy and the environment. This was the first US regional and Canadian climate change plan, and it led to two targets, actually three targets: 10% below 1990 levels by 2020, and an 80% below 2001 levels by 2050. I missed the first goal there, which was actually to achieve 1990 levels by 2010. Those were the three key greenhouse gas emission reduction targets in that Resolution 26-4 underneath Governor Rowland. That then led to actually a statute that was passed in 2008 underneath Governor Rell, which actually took those voluntary targets and put them into statute in Connecticut, specifically two of them: the 10% below 1990 levels by 2020 and the 80% below 2001 levels by 2050. Then you had Governor Malloy coming into office and led the passage of the 2030 target, which is 45% below 2001 levels by 2030. And of course, more recently, we have Governor Lamont, who then at the time, during just after his campaign, when he was elected to become governor, he had a number of things built into his climate plan. But when he became governor, he immediately came out with Executive Order 3, which we'll talk about here in a second, which proposes to seek 100% zero carbon electricity by 2040. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide here. So Executive Order 3 of Governor Lamont actually set a few things in motion. It reconstituted the Governor's Council on Climate Change, something known as GC3, expanding its responsibilities. So yes, it focused on mitigation and was seeking to achieve the target of 100% zero emission by 2040, but it also developed a process for us to begin to understand resiliency and adaptation to climate change and the need to develop a strategy to address resiliency and adaptation. It created several working groups underneath the two broad classifications of mitigation and adaptation. There were a number of subgroups underneath those larger working groups. For example, the Equity and Environmental Justice Working Group and the Financing, Adaptation, and Resiliency Working Group, which both Kathy and I serve on. It's important to say that Governor Lamont has made equity and environmental justice an important principle, a cross-cutting principle in terms of how Connecticut's going to address climate change. We want to see more investment being driven into and attracted to vulnerable communities so that they can mitigate emissions and be more resilient to the impacts of climate change. And then lastly, of course, there's always a need to monitor compliance towards those targets and publicly report and disclose progress we are achieving. So that was Executive Order 3. Let me go to the next slide and break down the problem a little bit more in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Connecticut. The number one emitting sector, you can see at the top there, that's transportation. This is pretty much where every state is across the country. Transportation tends to dominate greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, this isn't our second largest emitting sector, but it's an important sector to address, which is the electric power sector. I did mention before that Governor Lamont's 2040 target was to reach a zero carbon electric sector. And that is important because in order to decarbonize transportation and decarbonize our buildings, we need to move those technologies to a zero carbon electric sector. So that is really important, decarbonizing our electric grid. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the number two emitting carbon sector, and that's actually buildings. So you can see here industrial, commercial, and residential end use customers as the number two producing greenhouse gas emission sectors here in the state of Connecticut. It's important that we look at this sector because, what we're trying to do here is to decarbonize how we heat our buildings. This is where the emissions are coming from. If we do a better job weatherizing our buildings, well, first of all, understanding and auditing them to understand their energy consumption. Secondly, weatherizing them. And then third, thinking about renewable heating and cooling technologies to essentially electrify how we are heating those buildings using, again, zero carbon electricity, then we're going to, over time, reduce those emissions. On transportation, of course, when you think about that, we're talking about electric vehicles, right? So the combination of electric vehicles and renewable heating and cooling, moving those technologies to a zero carbon grid are effectively the three major climate wedges in the state of Connecticut. All right, so how do we get there, and how do we think about kind of where we are to where we need to go by, say, 2030? So, based on 2014 levels, we need to reduce our emissions by 34% in order to achieve where we need to be by 2030. This is all to say, from a Connecticut Housing and Finance Authority perspective, a Department of Housing perspective, green banks, all our community development corporations and affordable housing developers, that we all need to do our part in order to make these homes more efficient and reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. But while we're doing that, we're going to also help reduce the burden of energy costs on our most vulnerable citizens. So that's really important. And just kind of wrapping up here, in terms of some implications for housing in Connecticut. So we need a strategy for how we're going to get from here to there, right? So we can think about all the old buildings that were built before 2014. How are we going to reduce those emissions by 34%? And we also need to think about all the new buildings that are being built post 2014 or currently, and how those can achieve net zero emissions. So we're going to need to think about what our strategy is. Are we focused on our state-funded portfolio only? If we are, then we're going to need to outperform the private market in order to achieve those state goals. So there's lots ahead of us in terms of what we need to do to ensure that we can reduce those greenhouse gas emissions from the residential sector. Many people talk about carbon taxes or a cap and trade for carbon, but we all know that that is going to lead to increased costs for utilities. If you increase the cost of these things, that might reduce demand, therefore reducing emissions. Those policy approaches are less likely. I think if you were to take us to where we currently are today with President-elect Biden and Harris coming in from a national perspective, they very much have confronting climate change as a front and center platform, but they view it from a Build Back Better perspective, which is to say they want to see more high quality jobs that help working families. They also want to see the achievement of environmental justice investment and benefits, no less than 40% coming from the federal government. So jobs and equity are front and center in the president-elect's confronting climate change objectives. And when you think about that across US government, so this isn't just focusing on the typical agencies we think about from a climate perspective, Department of Energy, EPA. It goes beyond that. It goes to HUD, it goes to USDA, it goes to Treasury and more. So that's all to say we all need to be thinking ahead. How can we work to ensure that our housing is more sustainable in not only delivering reduced emissions in Connecticut and reducing the energy burden on our families, but also thinking about how the national picture plays into this strategy as well, because the structure of national incentives is very much going to be defined to support confronting climate. And with that, let me turn it over to the next presenter.
Thank you, Bryan. That was very informative. So one way to compare energy use in buildings is to use the HERS rating standard and the home energy rating system. We've done a little work here looking at the current QAP and trying to distill all the complications of the various standards in the current QAP and how those relate to the HERS index, which compares energy use in buildings using a scale of 0, which is none, using no energy at all, or the elusive net 0, and goes up to 100. The scale of 100 was set in 2009 when that was a code compliant new construction building. There are, of course, many buildings that have energy uses beyond that 100. Many properties in Connecticut might be at 150 or more. The great thing about properties in the CHFA portfolio and those that qualify for the low-income housing tax credits is that they are set on standards that are less than that 100. And beginning with currently in Connecticut, we have a building code that's a little over 70. We've done a little work here looking at the current QAP and trying to distill all the complications of the various standards in the current QAP and how those relate to the HERS index. Very few of the standards are set up for that to be the measuring standard that's used, but by averaging the standards, we've been able to look a little bit at this and hope this might be helpful in comparison. So the HERS index sets the International Building Code of 2009 as the standard and a rate of 100. As we can see, code has gotten more stringent over the years, and the current Connecticut code's a little over 70. And our standards for Energy Star, which are more rigorous than code, are in about 67 or so. That Energy Star standard is the standard that, as in Susan's previous presentation, inform enterprise green communities, the National Green Building Certification, and Energy Star certification. So although there's many other parts of those standards in terms of energy requirements, they're similar. In Connecticut, it takes a score of about 60 to qualify for the utility incentives that pay for part of the cost of certification and higher building standards. The 50 HERS rating is referred to in the acceptance of some of the other standards, and a typical passive house project comes in 35 to 45, so maybe with an average of 40. So to get a little perspective on the difference of the energy requirements we're looking at and then thinking a little bit about how those might help us in achieving goals of reduction in energy use going forward and approaching net zero. We start with some really good advantages in the CHFA minimum standards. Those include Energy Star. They include a reasonable amount of ventilation, although not the high performance ventilation that we increasingly look for, and they very wisely prohibit the use of dangerous materials in interior environments. As we have looked at those minimum standards, we think that they're probably missing some of the low-hanging fruit in the energy area, which might include resident training, construction verification, and benchmarking to be able to see if operations are meeting the required standards. As we look at additional points and a higher performance level, we're looking at things that go beyond the Energy Star requirement. Those include a super efficient building that might not include thermal breaks, air and moisture tight envelope, and ventilation at a higher, healthier level. And in order to achieve that and meet energy requirements, some kind of heat or cooling recovery in that system. So as we think about extra points, we may be thinking in the immediate future about things that move us to net zero and starting to standards that address embodied carbon as part of the criteria. And we see in LEED and other things some of the optional points addressing that with recycled materials and other considerations such as carbon sequestration. In the conversations, we've talked about some possible standards that include higher than Energy Star energy metrics. Those are the two passive house standards. They are also the NBI Zero Energy and the Enterprise Green Communities Plus that includes many other additional standards. As a next standard, if we look forward to what are the standards that include embodied energy in the construction, there's a broad range of those programs, and here's some examples of them. It's important as we look to climate change that we look specifically at the criteria for high performance building. Obviously, that includes carbon emission reduction. We hope that it includes longevity. That longevity is important both for cost, because the longer a building lasts, the less subsidy and resources we have to put in paying for rebuilding it or substantially repairing it. We, of course, care about occupant health. We care about resiliency, and that includes the ability of the building to maintain temperature during a time that power is lost, which is unfortunately increasingly frequent in Connecticut. We, of course, care about the capacity to build our green economy, and we care about saving the state money, and both because we're taxpayers, but also because that frees up resources for additional investment in housing. Thank you very much.